Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're zeroing in on a brand new agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine, an economic partnership agreement.
That's right. We've been digging into the reporting, mainly from CNN, and it paints a pretty interesting picture.
It really does. So the basics are the U.S. gets access, potentially, to Ukraine's critical minerals, yeah.
Uh-huh. Those rare earth minerals especially, hugely important for tech these days.
And in return, the U.S. helps set up an investment fund in Ukraine. Is that the
And it's
gist?
the core of it,
Yeah.
yes. Access for investment, essentially.
Okay, let's talk timing. This deal just got signed April 2025.
Right, but the talks, they've been going on for a bit, since January, actually.
Which lines up with President Trump returning to the White House.
Exactly. And the sources say it wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Weeks of tough negotiations.
Yeah, I saw that. And even a point where U.S. aid got held up temporarily.
It did. Which, really tells you something about the stakes involved here. It wasn't just a simple deal, lots of moving parts, politically too.
Definitely suggests some friction points along the way. So, for you listening, our mission here is to unpack this agreement. What's really in it, why now, and what could it mean going forward?
Let's dive in. What are the key bits of this agreement we need to focus on?
Well, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made a statement. He talked about the U.S. commitment.
Yeah, not just to ending the war, but like a longer-term vision.
Exactly. For a free, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine. That's the quote.
And he added something pretty pointed, didn't he? About who won't get to benefit from rebuilding Ukraine.
He did. Basically said anyone who bankrolled or supplied the Russian war effort is out. No profits for them from reconstruction.
That's a strong line in the sand, sets a clear political tone for this whole thing.
So what's the Ukrainian perspective? Their economy minister, Yulia Sviridenko, was key to the signing.
Right, and she was very emphatic, according to the reports. Ukraine keeps full ownership and control of its resources.
Including the subsoil stuff,
Yeah.
the minerals.
Everything. She stressed that Ukraine decides what gets extracted and where. Sovereignty over the assets was, well, clearly non-negotiable for them.
Makes sense. But even with that clarified, there was almost a snag right at the end. Something about signing documents.
Yeah, a last-minute disagreement over the actual paperwork. It almost derailed the whole deal, apparently.
Wow, that close.
It really highlights how sensitive these final details were. And remember, President Zelensky was supposed to sign something similar back in February during that Washington trip.
Oh, right, the trip that got cut short after that contentious Oval Office meeting.
Exactly. So that probably added some pressure and complexity to getting this finalized later on.
Let's back up a bit then. What were those earlier sticking points? You mentioned security guarantees.
That seems to have been a major one. Reports suggest Trump was, let's say, reluctant to offer security guarantees up front.
Before the economic deal was sorted.
That seems to be the implication. And that led President Zelensky at one point to describe an earlier draft as basically asking him to sell his country. That's a powerful quote.
It really is. Suggests he felt the economic side was being prioritized over security assurances, at least initially.
Which, from Ukraine's position, you can understand the apprehension.
So what changed? How did Ukrainian officials get from feeling like they were selling the country to seeing this as, well, a partnership worth signing?
It seems like there was a shift in thinking. The perspective evolved, maybe?
How so?
Well, the idea seems to be that getting major U.S. investment, having American companies actually on the ground in Ukraine, that might actually increase America's stake in Ukraine's security.
Ah, so the economic ties themselves become a form of security interest for the U.S.
Kind of a vested interest, you could say. If U.S. companies are there, the U.S. might be more inclined to ensure stability. It's a strategic calculation.
Interesting. And that whole episode with the aid being suspended after the White House visit, that must have sent shockwaves.
It definitely seems like it did. The aid did get restored, but the reporting suggests that pause was a bit of a wake-up call.
For who?
For European allies, primarily. It apparently spurred them to step up their own aid commitments to Ukraine.
So an unintended consequence, perhaps. Increased European support.
Potentially. It certainly complicated the U.S.-Ukraine dynamic for a bit, but maybe broadened the support base elsewhere.
Now, there's also President Trump's perspective. He apparently views this deal as Ukraine paying back the U.S. for past aid.
That framing is certainly out there. It's a very transactional view of the relationship.
But Ukraine pushes back on that.
Strongly. Ukraine's Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal, explicitly stated this agreement will not include assistance provided before its signing.
Okay, so they're drawing a line. Past aid is past aid. This is something new.
Exactly. They seem determined to frame this as a forward-looking, mutually beneficial partnership, not a repayment plan.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that partnership then, this investment partnership fund. What do we actually know about it?
Schmeihal described it as a strategic agreement to set up this fund. He really emphasized the equal and beneficial nature of it,
I mean,
meaning, ideally, equal contributions from both the U.S. and Ukraine, and, importantly, an equal share in managing the fund.
so a joint venture, basically.
That seems to be the structure they're aiming for. Collaborative.
But here's a detail that caught my eye.
Yeah.
The reports mentioned that new U.S. military aid could potentially count towards the U.S. contribution to this investment fund.
Yes, that's a really fascinating wrinkle, isn't it? It sort of blurs the lines between security aid and economic investment.
How might that work?
Well, the specifics aren't totally clear yet, but it suggests a very integrated approach. It implies that strengthening Ukraine militarily is seen as directly contributing to the economic stability needed for this investment partnership to work.
So security and economic goals are intertwined in the funding mechanism itself.
It looks that way. How that plays out in practice, how the accounting works, that'll be something to watch closely.
Definitely. Okay, let's pivot to the minerals themselves. This is the core interest for the U.S. side, presumably. What are we talking about here?
We're talking about significant deposits. Ukraine apparently has 22 out of the 50 materials the U.S. Geological Survey lists as critical.
22. Wow.
Like rare earth minerals, lithium, titanium, gallium, stuff that's absolutely essential for, well, almost everything modern.
Electronics.
Our green
Wow.
energy.
Yep. Smartphones, EV batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, and also some advanced defense applications. Certain weapon systems rely on these materials.
So they're foundational for key industries.
Absolutely. Building blocks for the 21st century economy and, frankly, defense.
And this ties into the global situation, right? Specifically with China.
Exactly. For years, China has dominated the mining and especially the processing of many of these critical minerals.
Which makes other countries nervous.
Very. It
Mm.
creates a huge supply chain vulnerability for the U.S., for Europe, for many others. So there's been a massive push to find and develop alternative sources, diversify away from that reliance. And Ukraine, with these deposits, looks like a prime candidate for that diversification.
Potentially a very significant one, yes, if these resources can be developed.
It's worth noting this isn't a brand new idea either. The Biden administration had already made moves in this direction.
That's right. There was a memorandum of understanding previously aimed at encouraging U.S. private investment into Ukraine's mining sector.
What was the condition for that?
It was tied to things like economic incentives, but also, importantly, good business practices, environmental standards, laying groundwork.
So this new agreement under Trump builds on that previous interest, perhaps formalizes it more.
It certainly seems like a more concrete, maybe more accelerated step, a formal partnership agreement rather than just an MOU encouraging investment.
And Ukraine already has a similar deal with the EU, right? From 2021.
Correct. They signed a strategic partnership on raw materials with the EU back then.
So Ukraine is clearly positioning itself, or being positioned, as a key player in this global scramble for critical resources.
It definitely looks that way. They're engaging with both major Western blocs, the US and the EU, on this front. It highlights how central these materials have become to geopolitics.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. This U.S.-Ukraine deal, it's way more than just digging stuff out of the ground.
Oh, absolutely. You've got the resource access angle, sure. But then there's the investment piece, the whole geopolitical strategy.
Right, countering Russia, building long-term ties.
And the huge push from the West to secure its own supply chains for these absolutely vital minerals. It ticks a lot of boxes.
It really signifies a potentially long-term U.S. commitment, framed perhaps differently under Trump, but a commitment nonetheless.
And one that explicitly links economic development with security outcomes, even in the funding structure.
So bringing it back to you, our listener, as we've unpacked this, it's clear it's a complex agreement with huge potential implications.
Definitely. Lots of layers.
Which leads us to a final thought to leave you with. Considering all the challenges, resource extraction in a country still facing conflict is incredibly difficult. And then you add the shifting global politics. What do you think are the biggest opportunities, but also the biggest hurdles for this U.S.-Ukraine partnership in the years ahead? And looking even broader, as this hunt for critical resources intensifies, what other kinds of global partnerships might we see pop up around the world?
Yeah, who else gets drawn into this game? Lots to chew on there.
Definitely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.